magical thing.
Grows where you are, it exists where you are.
An intentional journey to open up the pathways
To connect us to something bigger. It helps everybody in the equation.
has been the magic of the people, and it's passed from person to person.
You have to follow through. You have to do the thing. Like happy, safe place.
Is that your logic, or was that something you were told?
Focus on your craft and your practice. Just ask me why. Why in general?
Can you unteach yourself something that society has taught you?
Mystical experiences will always be different.
Your body is your temple.
You've probably been doing certain things your whole life.
You need nothing else other than what you're in right now.
This is Georgina. This is Nike.
And this is Temperance.
And welcome to Occultism with a Side of Salt.
Hello, this is Georgina.
This is Nike.
And this is Temperance.
And you are listening to Occultism with a Side of Salt. In this episode, we're going to be talking about who is a witch? What is a witch and who gets to be a witch? And the real question that everyone likes to bring up is, who is not a witch? I think when we're online, we see these discussions like, you're not a real witch if you do X, or people saying everyone's a witch, or people saying Jesus was a witch, and all sorts of claims like this. So let's actually discuss what a witch even is. To kind of kick this off, I wanted to talk about because this is a kind of complex topic, and that's why we're talking about it for an hour. So I thought it'd be nice to start with what do we as people think witches are? For me, my personal definition that I tend to grab towards when we talk about what defines a witch, because if you didn't know this, I identify as an occultist, not a witch. I call myself a ceremonialist or a ceremonial magician. I don't actually identify as a witch. Some things I do could be classified as witchcraft, but that's not my personal identity. I define witch as a very sort of specific form of European folk magic that has sort of these connections to concepts like transgression, liminality, this very, very kind of specific thing, and that's how I define it, but I know that's not how everyone defines it. Since my practices come from what we would call Western esotericism, they don't come from the lineages of witchcraft or kind of the sabbatic cults or anything like that, so I just don't personally call myself a witch, because if you look in history, the people who are practicing what would be sort of equivalent to what I practice now, like Aphelios LaVey, like John Dee, they would definitely not call themselves witches. So I just see witch as a specific type of European folk magic.
And for me, it's very broad as a term, and I really use it more in the context of how we view it in modern times, and if I had to give it a specific definition, it would be magical practitioner. But that's not to encompass all mystical, magical practices, all occult practices, because there are other practices that, even if they looked completely the same, one person might call themselves a witch while the other person would not. It's not to say that all those things are included. It's kind of like square, rectangle. Every rectangle is a square. Every square is a rectangle, but not every rectangle is a square type of deal. They look very similar, and could two squares could be called a square and a rectangle together. So it's really just if you choose to use the term for practicing magic, you can do that, but you don't have to.
I think for me, a witch is really anyone who uses the word to describe themselves. And that's kind of it. For me personally, I prefer to use the term practitioner. I won't correct you if you call me a witch, but I probably won't introduce myself as one. I consider myself a practitioner of magical arts, an occultist, but witch is something that I feel is a label people can apply to themselves. If they apply it, then it applies, and that's kind of it. I don't feel as though we can, now this is a hot take, I don't feel as though we can just call someone a witch because we want to, because what they look like they're doing seems to fit the mold of what we consider witchcraft. I don't think that makes someone inherently a witch. I think witches at the end of the day are all people who are seeking some sort of connection to the divine, and my use of the word divine is a little bit skewed towards my own belief system, but I think at the end of the day, witches in general are doing a deeper connection to the spiritual, to the spirit world with spirits. I'm using the word divine because that's how I connect to it, but witches do go much deeper in terms of the spirit and those planes than the average person. So it's more of a word that you apply if you feel like it fits versus a descriptor that meets a specific rigid standard.
I think a big issue, and something that started being discussed very recently, really for the first time, is how people apply witch to other people without necessarily knowing if that's how they identify. We see this a lot when people are talking about hoodoo or ATR. I've seen, especially, or people who are doing like sort of South American forms of occultism. You see like people calling hoodoo practitioners witches, and hoodoo practitioners, I see this a lot with hoodoo. It happens with other practices too, getting pretty offended because they see it as sort of applying a European term to them, and they find it insulting because in their culture, witch is used negatively. And so I think like when we talk about applying witch to other people, I try not to call someone a witch unless I know they're a practice like Wicca, where they inherently are going to identify as that. Just because, like, if there's someone from a tradition where the term witch is very offensive, it can get a little murky. It is a little Eurocentric to apply because the term does come from Europe. It's a European term. Though people who practice non-European things do use it for themselves, I don't think you should apply the European term to other cultures, like, because you want to say it and it looks similar to what you do if you're a self-identified witch.
I think an interesting thing that I'd like to bring up, and I don't actually agree with it, it was brought up on Twitter to me recently, that it's my viewpoint that we cannot apply the term witch to any type of mysticism. So I know we're going to get into that later in the episode, but it's my opinion that just because something contains mysticism doesn't equate it to witchcraft. And it was brought up to me on Twitter, well, historically, people were accused of being a witch. It wasn't something you self-identified as. That's a new thing. Yes, that is a new thing, but we're in 2021. We're not in 1600. We're not having witch trials. We're not accusing each other of witchcraft in at least America. Now we have to take into account this podcast is being recorded in North America. So my viewpoint is going to be from that perspective. We're not accusing each other of witches and stoning them here in America in 2021. So no, I don't think that even though there was a historical basis for accusations of witchcraft and that's how the term was applied, you were called a witch because someone determined you were a witch, whereas that may be the historical basis, I don't find that to be the modern basis for the word witch. And I think that's an important thing to note. And additionally, the witch label was an accusation term coming out of Europe. Now, we do still see that being played out in modern 2021 Africa, where people are being accused of witches, being killed as witches. We are seeing that play out in certain parts of Africa in today's culture and society, but that is not an issue in North America right now. And so I think it is important to denote that.
Yeah, I was going to bring up the Africa thing because there have been like even recent documentaries of that still going on. So it's definitely a very like Western first world kind of viewpoint about the word specifically, which I could be wrong on this. So like audience, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. I believe there's also parts of Asia, I believe, where that's also a thing, especially like in very highly colonized places. I believe like, I think it's like Cambodia and Laos and sort of that area. There are more like impoverished, what we would call like third world country type of places, just sort of all over the globe. But like Africa specifically is it's a big thing there still, especially because of the colonization that happened there. A lot of the reasoning behind a lot of this worldwide is definitely due to colonization and the spread of Christianity being the basis for like pointing at things and calling them witches, because we know about the witch hunts, but also just the general anti-polytheist, anti-pagan, whatever sentiments, just anti-non-Christian sentiments that basically led them to say anything that's not Christianity is of the devil, it's pagan, in like an insulting, evil way. They're all witches and this is all witchcraft. Like that's a very colonized sentiment. So we want to make sure that we acknowledge that because it is an important historical fact that goes along with the discussion of what is a witch.
And also, when we look at historical witch accusations, let's not do the offensive thing where we say that we're the lineages of the women who were murdered and men. Most of the people accused of witchcraft were basically accused for reasons that are not even occult. Yes, historically, some occultists, like John Dee, very famously, Marique Cosbon, wrote a big newspaper spread about how he was working with the devil. Like, sometimes actual occultists did get these accusations, but 99.99999999999% of the time, the people who died in the witch trials and the witch hunt, though all of them weren't actually burned, interestingly enough, were not witches or not practitioners. It was like women who did like science stuff and healed people, and there's a lot of things, and I think it's very offensive for us to pretend that they are our lineage. If you want to call lineage to someone who's been persecuted for their beliefs historically as an occultist, look at the Gnostics, look at like people who've been accused of heresy, because that's more likely going to be what would be closer to what we are now. It's very offensive to claim like the people who died in Salem are ancient witches, and it's very insensitive and something that as a community we should do a little less of. And I just want to point that out right now.
I think there's only, no, I'm not going to make a complete historical statement because I haven't researched it and I just thought of it as you were speaking. The only person that I can think of easily, readily, that was burned at the stake that also had ties to witchcraft accusations, interestingly enough, also not an occultist, Joan of Arc. I know that's not why she was completely tried and burned at the stake. There were other reasons there, including cross-dressing and her position and her power, but there were witchcraft accusations, and she's a patron saint of witches if you are Catholic. So there is, in terms of like people burned at the stake, we don't actually see a whole lot of documentation of burnings of witches, but that is one notable one that we do have. And she wasn't a witch, just it's part of the accusations.
Yeah. And people, I think another thing that's interesting to bring up is people who sort of have started identifying as a witch, not as practitioners, but as people reclaiming the term in that sort of feminist context. Because I see it's a small group of like women, mostly people who you would call like radical feminist or second wave feminist, who use the term witch, not like the Dianic Wiccans or people who have like feminist influences on their practice, people who just reclaim the term witch as a feminist statement. That's just reclaiming a term that was used against women. That's not like a practitioner of witchcraft, but I don't think we can really necessarily gatekeep them from using the word because they're using it in a different context, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I definitely have run across some people that are using witch in more of the like feminist context way, but also call themselves practitioners. And obviously, this is not all. If this is a little too controversial, we may have to cut it out. I'm not sure. But I have often found issue with people claiming the word witch as a heritage of being a woman who is also spiritual. And obviously, not all. Again, not all. I'm aware. But many of the super feminist women that use witch to connect their femininity and their identity as a woman often branch into being very womb-centric and transphobic. And that comes with its own issues. And it's not to say that they aren't witches, but the specific like feminist slate to it often comes with not a focus on femininity and womanhood. It's wombs, like the ability to give birth to children, to have a uterus, and to have a natural female body. Heavy air quotes for audio listeners. It becomes a problematic area that I just stay very far away from.
Well, cancel me for this, but throughout the whole history of what we know as occultism, spirituality, mysticism, magic, alchemy, a lot of men.
As a ceremonial magician and a woman, there's almost no way I could have been a ceremonialist and a woman prior to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn.
No, and you can say what you want about misogyny, or that's not right, or it should have been, or whatever. We're not getting into the nuance of ceremonial versus folk magic. We're not doing that. That's not the purpose of this episode. But, there is no basis at all to gatekeep men from the term witch, which is a gender neutral term. Men have been involved in magic, mysticism, spirituality for a very long time, and it's a very modern take to say men can't be witches, especially because many men were killed as witches during the trials. So if men could be accused and killed as witches for the trials, and you're going back to saying, we're the descendants of the witches you couldn't burn, all right, if that's the line that you're saying, well, there were men that died because of that. So there's no basis to it.
And the same goes for my transgender and non-binary friends who are listening to this. There's no reason you can't do any form of witchcraft either. They're all for history in all sorts of things. Even like in Norse culture, there were two forms of magic, and I simplify them down to like boy magic and girl magic. There's Galder, which was more ceremonial, still in that same vein, and Satyr, which was, to really boil it down, more of like intuitive and astral, those kinds of sort of like wooey, not wooey as in like woo-woo kind of stuff, but like harder to define, much more loose kinds of things. So it's definitely, and like men practice Seder and women now practice Galder. Like there's nothing that should stop you, my trans and non-binary friends, from doing any form of magic. So if anybody tries to tell you that, they're a dick and can get fucked.
It's my opinion, there is no gender to divinity. Divinity can take shape however it takes shape.
Yeah, I think that when we talk about gender in esotericism, when we look at where like these gendered ideas come from, especially if we're talking about Kabbalah, right? Because there is gender in Kabbalah. It's the female principle and the male principle have nothing to do with our human concepts of gender. The male principle is endless giving and the female principle is shaping. That doesn't have anything to do with like how you dress or femininity or masculinity. It's endless creation versus endless structure. So that's not really connected to like human gender concepts. So even when we look at like esoteric ideas of gender, it's not like, it doesn't have to do with like genitalia or anything like that. It's much more abstract. Certain rituals, especially in like Tantra, you do see that type of stuff, but those are typically for very specific ritual formulas and don't like gatekeep anyone from a practice. It's like a handful of rituals. It's not whole practices, if that makes sense.
Well, and I got shit on for making a post just recently as a small aside. A couple weeks ago or whenever the hell it was, you can find it still. I made a post saying that I don't use masculine and feminine. I use projective and receptive, or, you know, a number of other words for like that dichotomy, because like as a non-binary person, I just feel very divorced from the concept of gender. And while those words are not supposed to be in reference to human gender, the words themselves are so entrenched in those gender roles that I just find it easier to describe those concepts with different words because we have the language to describe them. There's not a reason I have to use feminine and masculine. So like that's an important point I think to bring up. Is just like you don't have to call it the same thing either.
Well, even in Kabbalah, right, where we have these principles, there's still the color of the middle pillar, right? There's still the magical child. There's that gender ambiguous thing. Like Mercury is neither feminine nor masculine. It's both. There's still that androgyny. If you look at Baphomet, that's the androgyne, and that's from Olivius LeVay. Like this idea of an androgynous or what we would call non-binary, now they didn't have those terms, does still exist in Western esotericism. It just is described as like the androgyne or the magical child. So there's some basis for you, yeah. Even in that system.
So all that to say, anybody can do anything. Don't let people fucking gatekeep you from shit because there's not really any specific thing that would say you are definitely not a witch.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the most basic "are you a witch or not" is just whether you practice or use the term. I think like when we talk about like types of magic that are associated with witchcraft has a very strong folk magic association. Just because when we talk about traditions like traditional witchcraft, which if you actually look into the history of traditional witchcraft, it's not that old. It's not really that much older than something like Wicca. You can get into like really detailed historicism and some people saying that it's actually quite similar to what Wicca is, and there's a lot of parallels. I don't want to get into all of that, but like these forms of like traditional witchcraft aren't that old, but they all sort of like every sort of basic understanding you see of a witch, it typically has a folk magic connotation, I've noticed.
When I hear people say whether or not somebody is or isn't a witch, it's always in the sense of like there's like sort of two mindsets on what a witch is generally, and it's almost like there's practitioners. Are they actually practicing? Are they actually doing these things, or are they just bullshitting? Versus like more of a lifestyle, which sounds really weird to say, but like the witch lifestyle, and sometimes it's more of the gatekeeping of the lifestyle in a weird way. Like you can make valid arguments in some senses of like, this person clearly hasn't read up on this. They clearly haven't done their research on it. They sound like they're talking out of their ass, like the academic perspective of how do they actually know what they're talking about? What knowledge have they attained? What things have they done physically? You know, how many rituals have they done to be able to have this opinion? Versus just like, are you witchy enough in a very strange way of like, you're not feminine enough. You're not into this, you know, that like, oh yeah, you're a fan of this band. Name every single song they've ever done or appeared on, like that kind of attitude.
Well, I will say if we're talking about the witchy lifestyle, I'm 100% gate kept out. I'm not crafty. I do keep environmentally friendly, but I'm not like, I live in a major city. I don't really have a witchy aesthetic. I dress like
You mean you're not cottagecore?
I dress like a Russian monarch.
You know what? I feel like actually I'm with you.
I'm gay cap out here.
Out of it because I own a car and I have to use.
Oh, I don't own a car.
Job.
I live in New York City. I don't own a car. So does that give me a witch point? Because I have to take
one
public
witch
transit.
point.
That takes away a witch point from me. But, you know, I feel like I too would probably be gate kept from, like, I don't have black hair with a straight bang cut, and I don't dress in all black, and I don't like listen to super edgy music. And you know, I'm gonna say this, and I know it's like trending on TikTok, but if you've been around my content for a while, you know that I listen to sea shanties, and I was called out on this for a YouTube video 2 years ago. I actually got so embarrassed because in the YouTube video, we like went to my Spotify, and my Spotify was like, it popped up real quick, and someone was like, "Is that sea shanties for thoughts?" And I got so embarrassed that I unlisted the YouTube video. So I think, you know, for the witchcraft lifestyle, here's kind of what I think, and you know, I want to really touch on it briefly before we move on, is ethical content creation. And I know that's going to sound weird, and I probably wouldn't have thrown those words together except for I saw someone on Twitter use that term, ethical content creation. As a content creator, you are somewhat responsible for what you say and what you put out. And if you follow a content creator who makes witchcraft content that cites Dante's Inferno as 100% accurate demonolatry, like, that's maybe not the content creator that you want to be following. That's a witchy aesthetic versus witchcraft. You know, if we're talking demons, let's get into like Solomon. Let's get into Goetia. Like, why are we you know, I think that, you know, that section of Divine Comedy was great if you're willing to read it and you have the knowledge to comprehend it, but it was a fiction work, so...
True. So anyway, moving on. God, where are we on the outline? Hold on.
I think don't pick content creator based on aesthetics. I think the witchy aesthetic has a lot of appeal. It's kind of a trend right now, but that's not the core of what the practice of witchcraft is.
And we have a full episode on this, right? Like, we have an aesthetic versus whatever episode, do we not? I swear we do.
We have a plastic witchcraft episode.
We've addressed it before. It's in other episodes. How about you go back and listen to all of our catalog, and you'll find us talking about it. There we go.
Listen to just like 30 hours of OWASP.
Please do.
Actually, please do. I would like...
Only real fans.
If you haven't listened to every single second of every episode, including the Patreon bonus sections, fake
stan.
You're a fake witch. Actually, that's what determines whether you're a real witch or not. It's whether or not you're a super OWASP fan. And that's the tea.
So I would like to bring us into the next section now that we've been derailed. You know, mysticism and witchcraft, and we were talking about it earlier, and it's finally time to get there. Mysticism and witchcraft, you know, what is witchcraft, what is mysticism, the dichotomy between the two. However, the reason why this is getting brought up is because I have a background in folk Catholicism. Now, my mother taught me pretty much everything I know about what I do, aside from what I've like learned as an adult about like occultism. But in terms of my day-to-day practice, my daily driver shit, my mom taught me a lot of it, and it was taught from the folk Catholic perspective. Now, my mother and my grandmother would have railed me to fucking church had I called what they were doing witchcraft. That would not have been an acceptable word. There is a strong basis of mysticism in Catholicism and in a lot of things, and it's my opinion that we can't just ascribe the word witchcraft to everything that is mysticism. Mysticism is such a broader thing than just witchcraft.
Well, also, mysticism tends to look pretty different from witchcraft. Like, the mysticism system I know the most about is Kabbalah, which there are certain things that sort of vaguely resemble what we would think of witchcraft, like some of the practical aspects of Kabbalah, sort of. But generally, mysticism is much more about a connection to a higher entity and sort of the dissolution of the self into that. It's a lot less practical focused and a lot more like about that connection and that devotion and discipline. So it's not the same thing, and it looks very different. And people who are mystics don't tend to hang out in witchy circles as much. I see crossover with like ceremonial spaces, but it's It's a different group of people. It's got different intentions and it's a different thing. And I think it's very reductive to say Jesus was a witch. Kabbalists are witches, or Merkaba mystics are witches. It's reductive, and it takes the traditions out of their context. Like talking to a Sufi person who's into Sufi Islam, which is the biggest Islamic mystic tradition, they're going to have a very, very different perspective than what we would call in Islam a sorcerer who works with the jinn, right? That's a very different practice. And that jinn practice would be more similar to what we think of as witchcraft or occultism. So it's really like they're different things, and it's just simplistic and reductive and minimizes sort of the complexities of these traditions to say they're all the same thing.
And I want to bring up just one more time as like a really stressing the point kind of thing, especially in things that are like ATR and hoodoo, even I believe to a point like Appalachian folk magic, to call that witchcraft, or even to some people calling it magic in general, would be very offensive. You don't call them that because that's not what they are. I know that from what I understand of hoodoo and voodoo, you would, I don't know if it's like both or just hoodoo specifically, but they go with like conjuremen, conjure workers, root workers. Like they use different terms for what we would call mystics or magical practitioners, but it's definitely not the same word, even if what they do looks exactly the same. In Greek mysticism, there is, and I'm going to probably pronounce it wrong, there is essentially something that is pretty much akin to like a hoodoo puppet or doll baby or voodoo doll, or whatever term that people are most familiar with. But I believe it's pronounced kolosoi or something like that. But it's essentially the same thing. And what I might call it as a Greek pagan, being like, sympathetic magic, and I call myself a witch, and I use this doll for the same purpose, they wouldn't necessarily call it the same thing, and it would be horribly offensive to them to say that, oh yeah, we're both witches, we both do magic, because we both do the same thing. It looks the same, may even sound the same, it's not the same to the individual.
That is the distinction, right? Is because I will use the word witchcraft to describe a lot of what I do today. But like I said, my mother and my grandmother would not have used that word. So like I posthumously for them, like say, oh yeah, like I learned this from my mom, like I learned witchcraft from my mom. I did, because I describe it that way. But she may not have described it that way in her own personal life and her own personal practice. And that's something important to note, that differs between practitioner to practitioner is where your beliefs lie, where does your base of knowledge lie, where are you creating that divide between what may be cultural, what may be mystic, what might be, other. There is divides between that, and it's not gatekeeping to acknowledge those divides.
There's also another thing to consider, that what we would now distinguish as separate from like mundane regular action, like regular life versus magic or ceremony and ritual, it wasn't really regarded as a separate thing. You put on your shoes, you do a little offering to the gods, you say a prayer, you go out for your day. Like it's just part of what you do. It wasn't, all right, I'm going to get dressed, and then I'm going to do some magic, and then I'm going to go about my day. Like it wasn't a separated concept. And like culturally, that's one of the big mental shifts that has happened, is we see magic as being completely separate from anything else. And for a long time, the mystic arts were regarded as a science. So it was part of science. It was just like another subsection of other things. And so us distinguishing magic from science or magic from the mundane is really, really new. So that's another thing to consider, that, historically, they wouldn't have been considered something weird or separate. And there was a difference of like seers and prophets and oracles and whatever, but, the deity work and ritual work and offerings and whatever, it wasn't separate. So you kind of have to shift your thinking on that one too.
I want Georgina to give definition of witchcraft versus mysticism, because if there's an ism, Georgina's going to have the best definition.
So this is my definition for witchcraft versus mysticism. I see witchcraft in its more traditional form as a form of folk magic that is a European term that would emerge in the post-Christian period onwards with influences from paganism prior. It's a post-Christian term. That's when the term witch gained popularity, though you do see similar terms prior to it. And so now when we talk about the modern sort of internet definition of the witch, it's anyone who is a magical practitioner in a folk tradition who sort of self-titles a witch. once again, you see mostly European practices. A mystic is someone who does devotion to the divine and is trying to connect to the divine and submit to the divine through a mystic process like Merkaba, Kabbalah. There's a lot of prayer. It's a lot less about like making things happen and more about connecting to the spirits. They're not mutually exclusive. Someone can do both. But that's how I personally separate them and how I would define the difference. Like witchcraft is much more secular. Mysticism is absolutely not secular.
I agree. I think that's probably like where I have like an issue sometimes translating what I want to say, what I want to think in my head versus what comes out, because we can't all put the words post with anything and make it make sense like you do. Like I'm like, oh yeah, like connection to divine, like that's, you know, that's it. And so I think, you know, the way we translate what we're saying is, you know, different, but the root meaning is the same. And I do agree with your divide between the two.
Yeah, definitely. And like the shifting realm of like mysticism into witchcraft, I also think that there's definite overlap that often gets overlooked. And I think with like the witchcraft lifestyle people and people that self-identify as like baby witches, they don't know that this distinction exists because the only thing they've been exposed to is the word witch and witchcraft. It's very trendy. They see like the tiny little like necklace size little bottles and people doing jar spells that way, and they light some incense and they meditate, and they don't have any idea that some of the concepts that they're using, some of the stuff that they may be familiar with, like yoga and chakras, even though that system that they know is not exactly the only one out there. But, you know, that's a different topic. They get exposed to these things through osmosis and don't really understand the roots and the differences between those things. Where would you guys say that is the most overlap that newbies wouldn't really know that would be more in the realm of mysticism versus witchcraft?
Deity work. Because people associate deity work and pagan devotion with witchcraft. I see it a lot. You can't work with deities if you're a beginner. I think that doesn't make sense because more people are devotional people than witches, right? Working with a deity for most people is just prayer and offerings. And people associate, like new witches think deity work is ? They're like, have a candle for your deity on your offering, on your altar, which is a religious thing. And then they are like, I use them for spells, but they don't really understand the concepts like invocation and evocation. And so like, it's like this blend of like witchcraft with like devotional polytheism. And I think people don't realize like witchcraft is a craft and devotional polytheism aren't the same thing. That's where I would say kind of that muddy realm for people who are super new comes up.
I think, well, I do agree with you. I'm going to say that I think it comes up a lot in actually how we practice ritually doing magic, because a lot of people come into like the spells through the lens of Wicca because the first texts that they read are probably Cunningham or Buckland, and they're reading how to cast a circle and call quarters and all that stuff. And I think that that's probably the first interaction that someone will have if they haven't got to deity work yet, because, you know, there's a whole thing of like, I don't know what deity I'm supposed to be working with and blah, 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 blah. But maybe they try casting a circle first. I think somewhere between the circle or deity work, maybe the first interaction that someone has with that connection.
I always find that it's also like it's a very similar concept of that sort of intersection of folk magic and ceremonial magic, where like that blend also tends to sort of fit into both, which it's also why I like that sort of distinction between folk magic and ceremonial stuff being sort of that same dichotomy. And just an interesting note, I've also found funny enough that people who work with deities don't call themselves religious, even though that's literally what they're doing.
Yeah. I mean, I consider it religious personally. But I also self-identify as religious. I think if you're praying to gods and worshiping them and invoking them, you're religious. But that's a different conversation. I think, yeah. Because I think witch and pagan get merged a lot when not all pagans are witches. I'd honestly guess the majority of pagans would be what we would classify as like devotional polytheist, right? I mean,
I agree. Yeah, because a lot of my friends who are into the Norse heathenry stuff, No,
I don't have any statistics on this.
If you let me
I would be
explain.
willing to say, I would be willing to almost argue that it would be a pretty even split between polytheists and henotheists, because a lot of people don't even realize that that's an option, but that's what they're doing anyways. Like, I would consider myself in the henotheist category because I devotionally work with one God, but I do acknowledge the existence of many more.
Well, and for my crowd, I have many, many, many friends that are Norse heathens. They worship one or two Norse gods, but they don't do any witchcraft stuff or things that we would consider witchcraft or folk magic for the most part. It's just devotion to that god. So they are very much in the religious camp versus doing any magical practice at all. It's actually, for the people that I know in real life, and obviously it's going to vary space to space, but in terms of like my sizable grouping of about 300 to 400 people that I can pull from, it's definitely like, if they're into any of just the general realm of any of this, the majority of them are just devoted to a god, or 2 or 3 gods, or like a pantheon of gods. And I think 3 of us out of probably about 40 or 50 do any work that we would call magic or mysticism. It's like one person that I'm pretty close with and one that I'm not close with, but those people specifically. Everything else is really just religious devotional work. And so, like, those people wouldn't call themselves witches, as is sort of the point I wanted to like wrap around to. They wouldn't consider themselves witches, and to call them a witch would be wrong. It wouldn't be correct.
I personally think the terms should be divorced, like witch and pagan, personally, because there is a basis for witches from specific religions. So like Christian witches, I know that's a controversial take, but there are people who identify as that. And so those people are not pagan. I don't think that the word pagan directly is always married with the word witch.
I agree. It's definitely 2 separate things. And as much as there is overlap, I think that there's enough distinction between the 2 groups that to conflate them is often a problem.
Well, there are a lot of people, I think, more than like people who are Christian witches or other sort of faiths that identify as witches as well. They're not traditionally associated. I think there's a lot of atheist or I think secular may be a better term, but like there are a lot of people who you would definitely not classify as pagan who are like secularist who are witches. That's a pretty sizable camp, actually.
Yeah.
I know quite a few people who are in that category.
Well, and up until recently, Olivia from The Witch of Wonderlust didn't do any deity work. She did ancestor work and she did like magic and witchcraft, but she didn't do anything with any pagan deities until 7 months ago. Thereabouts, like when she started doing that Hecate course with Jason Miller. That was her first deity work, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was, I don't know if it was her first, but it was her first one that she devoted herself to because she was in the class. So she had to stick with it. That I know.
But just generally, her practice was secular. Yeah.
Yeah, I know Chewan from Witches and Wine identifies as an atheist. I'm sure I could think of a couple more if I gave it time, but there's a sizable camp.
I did for a long time before I came around. Like, I think for me, it was like a backlash when I left organized religion and Christianity. I went through a backlash period where I was like, no, I'm like, an atheist. And then I was like, actually, I'm probably agnostic. And then it was a slippery slope back into God.
Yeah, I had a very similar path where it was like, I didn't grow up with any religion, so I never had any like basis, but I was atheist for most of my life because religion was just never a thing. And apparently my mom has told me that she had a friend who like read her tarot cards several different times when I was around. I just didn't have any memories of this, but I was atheist. And then I had like a very, very short Christian phase, mostly just because we had friends who all went to church and they had like one of those cool churches. So I was Christian for like a month, which is weird to say I had a Christian phase, but I did. And then I went back to atheist and then agnostic. And then eventually when I started exploring more of the sort of mystical stuff, that was just sort of that slope back into it. Because in my mind, it was like, if I believe in all these other intangible things, why would deities be, so far out of the realm? Why would that be something that would be like inconceivable to me if I believe in all these other things? So it definitely was that Christian atheist slide around too.
I've always been religious. I've never had a secular moment or an atheist moment. When I was a kid, I essentially came up with Gnostic heresy organically.
With your bathroom demons?
I did. So when I was young, like very young, I read the Bible a lot because I found it. I read a lot when I was a kid. I loved reading. That never really changed. And I read the Bible a ton. And I was obsessed with certain sections. And so I basically invented Gnosticism. I thought that God was a tyrant who was abusing his angels. Basically just came up with Gnosticism. And I was basically like Luciferian, like my entire like childhood to when I started practicing.
Was your favorite passage that one you threatened to read backwards to that girl to curse her?
I tried to curse someone when I was in elementary school. Yeah, this girl, Megan, she was mean to my friends, so I tried to curse her by reading the Bible backwards. But really, like, after that, I sort of just stuck to this, like, kind of deist, Gnostic perspective, and then I got into the occult, and I became whatever's happening here. So...
I for sure just subtweeted this. Like, people are probably going to be like, what?
No, I've never been secular. I always believed in stuff. I had some weird experiences, too, so... I don't know. I've never been an atheist. I definitely thought like God was an asshole though. Like I wasn't a Christian, but I was absolutely religious. I mean, sometimes when you're 6, you just invent Gnosticism by accident. I just honestly needed to get a hobby.
And now it's your whole life.
Are we all checking my subtweet to this?
Yes, absolutely we are.
Darling. I'm gonna quote tweet it instead of retweet it. 6-year-old me was woke and should have been burnt for heresy.
Imagine if the church found out.
Oh no, I asked when I was like 12. There was a camp. I went to this like church weekend, right? And there was like a youth pastor, and I pulled them aside, and I was like, I have some religious questions. And I was like, there's certain things that I just am struggling with. And I talked to them about how the Great Flood I thought was genocide. I talked to them about how Lucifer only killed a couple people, so why is he the bad guy? Talked to him about like why I thought God was kind of mean to the angels and the angels kind of needed like workers' rights. And I had this conversation for like 2 hours because I had so many questions. And this youth pastor was horrified. They were like, I was like 12 and I was like bringing up like these passages and they were like, Georgina, God is great and God is good. And I'm like,
they probably
but what about
the parents?
They should have.
Do you really question why people call you a communist? Transfer the means of production of heaven to the angels.
Look, okay, I really was...
Angels need a union.
No, they did. That's kind of what Lucifer was doing. If you think about it, Lucifer is kind of like the Che Guevara of the Bible, right? Because Lucifer, like God made the angels serve humans, and Lucifer was like, that's not what I signed up for. Like, I kind of thought like Lucifer was like this like rebel. And let me just tell you, the church people were mildly concerned. No, this is like a real conversation I had. Like, I was having like an existential crisis, and this poor youth pastor who was like 20 was sitting with me in this like corner at the camp, and was like, "It's like, what is this girl?" But I wanted them to like. It was like an existential crisis. Okay. By the way, I'm not cutting part of that from the final show.
I'm going to include so many tweets. Fuck. Oh God.
I just honestly like.
Why do people call me a communist? I don't get it. Come on the show dressed like this, talking about that.
Look, I'm just saying, 6-year-old me thought way too much about the Bible and should have like gotten a copy of Harry Potter and not like read the Bible obsessively. Which actually people ask me a lot why I like Jack Parsons and Crowley. And like both of them did that when they were a child. And I read it later and I was like, me too.
I'm taking a Twitter poll. Did Lucifer get expelled for trying to lobby for workers' rights? Yes or no?
I'm saying yes.
This is what childhood me believed. I'm quote tweeting with that. He did! If you think about it, he did! Like, tell me you can't see how this would happen in your brain.
Look, I see the logic. I see where you're going with it. I see what you're doing there. My questions, so I had similar yet different questions. So I went to a Christian school for middle school because of the area that I live in if you can avoid sending your child to public middle school, you do. And so there was this Christian school that was cheap, and my parents could afford to put me in it, so I was in it. And we were going through the section where God rained down fire on the Israelites or whatever, and I had so many questions about that. Why did they deserve it? And then like later up, like there was the whole idol worshiping bit that got brought up, and I was like, I don't really see what's so wrong about this, because we have the bull statue in Wall Street and like whatever else. And yeah, I was also not a prime candidate, but I definitely wasn't your level. I wasn't lobbying for Lucifer's rights.
Okay, I'm just saying there's certain things that make you raise questions. This is honestly like when I was younger, like I was a really well-behaved kid, but I was kind of like, I brought up these type of questions like all the time. I don't know how my parents dealt with me.
On a scale of 1 to 10, Temp, how well-behaved were you as a child?
Do I have to give an answer?
I mean, you don't have to. I would just be like, if Georgina's the goody-goody, where are you? Because I want to know if you're in the middle, or if you were on her side, or if you're on my side.
I was one of those kids that was like only got along with adults. So I don't know, I was an only child, and I played video games quietly in my room because that's what was expected of me. I was an okay child, but in school I probably wasn't an okay child, because I had really bad ADD, and that was like at the time when like your options were Adderall or Ritalin, and like I just probably was not an optimal child. I had organization issues. I got up from my desk and walked around a lot. I spoke out of turn. I was probably not the ideal child.
I was definitely like, so in my like kindergarten class, we had a wheel, and it was like, your classic green, yellow, red. And we had our names on clothespins. So if you were bad, they'd move it to yellow. And then if you were bad again, they'd move it to red. And I was on red every single fucking day, because I don't even remember what I did. I imagine it was because I was loud and I didn't want to listen to anybody, because I basically thought I was an adult from the time I was born. I didn't want anybody telling me what to do. I would get bored because I would finish all the assignments really fast, and then I'd get in trouble for like being bored and being like, but I did it, but I know this already. Why do I have to sit here? Like, I couldn't understand the concept of being in school. I was like, I learned it. Can I go home now? I'm done. No, you can't go home. I also could never nap. Like, I have distinct memories of getting in trouble for not sleeping during nap time in like kindergarten. And I was like, but I'm not tired. I want to play. You're oppressing me.
Yeah. Well, okay, but what was the big rumor about you when you were younger? Because everyone thought I was either a Satanist or a communist.
Wait, how young are you going? Like how old?
Just whatever's your favorite. Whatever's your favorite. Because mine is just repetitively like 10 different times people thought I was either a Satanist or a communist. So I'm curious about you guys. I can now that I'm thinking about it, I can kind of see why people got that idea.
I never had any big rumors about me, because I was a really just like open book person. So it was less rumors, and it was more, oh, there's that fucking weird girl who shouts about being gay, and she's also like one of the art kids, and she does like the theater shit. She's just fucking weird and loud, and we don't like her. What a weirdo. Like, it wasn't rumors, it was just, ew.
I feel like there also wasn't rumors about me. It was all just true things that got said. Like, oh, you know what? In a high school, there was a rumor that I was in a cult, but also that was actually true. So, because, okay, so like to explain that to OWASP listeners,
we have a cult episode where you
we literally have an episode where you explain it.
And I explained the story of how I ended up in a cult by court order until I was 18. But so where I lived, we would go to the local public high school. And the kid that sat next to me, like his locker was next to mine, and he sat next to me in one class. He was like, "Do you need help escaping?" And I was like, "No, I'm fine." He was like, "It's that cult mentality." And I was like, "Yes, okay, goodbye."
Except it was. You did need to escape. He should have said yes.
And be cut off from my money? No, thank you. I was gonna age out soon anyway.
Oh, Temp.
Well, back to the topic at hand. Where are we now?
Spirituality today.
Yeah, spirituality today.
So I'm going to say the ooh-woo thing. Don't give people titles they don't want, and don't gatekeep people from labels they want. You telling them they aren't a witch isn't going to do anything either, so just save the oxygen.
There's no blood quantifier to being a witch. There's no blood quantifier to being a witch. You can't prove if someone is or isn't a witch, especially if you're not in person with them. I feel like if you have psychic ability, psychic, level that you've gotten to within yourself, some people would probably be able to tell if you have an ability or affinity for witchcraft or psychic ability person to person. But over the internet, you don't know who you're dealing with. You don't know what you're seeing, what you're dealing with, if you're meeting them or their representative. I mean, there's a lot of questions in that, and I just don't think that you can definitively say who is or isn't a witch, because there's no tattoo. You don't say like, oh, I'm a witch, and then bam, you're branded with it. There's no way to tell.
There's no witches' marks.
My opinion on spirituality today is less targeted at our audience, because our audience tends to skew a little older, skew a little bit more academic. I mean, it fits what our podcast is about.
Big brain people, 200
yes,
IQ.
Biggest brain. I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of spirituality today is based on colonized things that have been watered down for the sake of white comfort. Things like yoga and chakras and like opening your third eye and crystals. And, a lot of it is very colonized, very Eurocentric practices taken from other cultures and then bastardized for like fun aesthetics. I think it's important to recognize that, because we can think it's all well and good to do these practices and to try to incorporate them into our spirituality, but we're getting the white watered down version a lot of the time, and it's not the truest form of that practice. And it's not to say that it's invalid to try to incorporate those things, but you also have to recognize that if you're going to incorporate them, I would say either one, you need to incorporate them correctly, or two, you need to publicly recognize that you are incorporating colonized concepts, watered down concepts. It's just simply not the same.
If you want to learn about a cultural practice, learn it from people from that culture.
Yes, and I definitely have a soft spot for a lot of this, because I grew up in a very heavily Indian area, like people from India. And so those concepts were very familiar to me and very in a way personal, because I could see how frustrating it was for them to have their culture watered down to this cute fun thing that white yoga moms do, and they have incense and crystals, and I do yoga, I'm opening my third eye by doing meditation. And they were like, you're taking a sacred practice and just making it for funsies, and it's really annoying, because when I try to talk about my stuff, you just tell me it's fucking weird and stupid and that I should turn to Jesus. Shut up. It's disingenuous to not acknowledge that is a thing that has taken over a lot of modern spirituality. And, we address the witch talk shit and how they water down folk magic and mysticism in that way. We touch on that enough. I really just wanted to point out the colonized part specifically.
A big shout out to my ex-boyfriend's mother. He was Punjabi, and she gave me some of her recipes because he lived in a different state and he missed her cooking. So she sent me some of her recipes. Best Indian food ever. No one in South Florida makes it like these recipes do, because she was not native to North America. So her recipes were genuine, the best food ever. And I use that as an example just because to say that if you want to learn about a culture, get it directly from someone with the source.
And just don't be a dick.
True. I mean, you'd think that would be easy, but it's apparently not. And
it's very much not. People in our community don't follow that. As we know, our listeners are 200 IQ, but
I think our listeners don't even need to listen to our episodes to know what is going on here, because based on my poll, I'm just going to give a poll update at the time of recording. My poll, did Lucifer get expelled for trying to lobby for workers' rights, has 29 votes. 90% of voters have voted yes. And one person commented, this is the future that liberal, gay, anarchist, space, communist spies want. I feel like our listeners know us.
But yeah, so my final thoughts are, let's just let people use the words they want as long as they're using them semi-correctly. If someone's saying that they're the granddaughters of the witches that didn't burn when actually their grandma's alive and is a lovely lady, then maybe you can say something. Or if someone's like saying something that's like historically inaccurate. But in general, if you say you're a witch, you're a witch. I have a specific definition, but like obviously like the modern definition of a witch is not that definition. Just don't throw titles on people without them wanting that title, and just put some thought in your own title. Take it, like think, what do I want to be a witch? Is that really what I do? And put some thought into it. Yes, that's my final thoughts.
Remember that you're only a witch if you have one of these honking things. Otherwise, you're a faker.
Yeah, if you don't have the hipster hat.
Final thoughts is that if you are not, if something is not harming you, if something doesn't harm someone else, if something doesn't harm anyone's culture, it's not your job to gatekeep them. You're not the internet witch police. Just let people live their lives. If they want to say they're a witch or they're not a witch, that's their business, not your business. And as long as they are not actively harming a closed culture, which I don't know if we have an episode on. If we don't, we probably won't.
We don't.
Not yet.
We'll get there eventually. If it's not harming a practice, just let them live their lives.
And my actual final thoughts are, you can label yourself as whatever you want. Don't force labels onto other people. It's not cool when people do it in the queer community. Don't do it in the occult community. Call yourself a witch all you want. If your best friend has the exact same look and practice, but don't call themselves witches, don't label themselves a witch. Don't label them a witch for them. It's up to them to choose their title. Just don't be a dick.
This is Georgina.
This is Nike.
This is Temperance.
And you've been listening to Occultism with a Side of Salt. You can help support Occultism with a Side of Salt on Spotify, YouTube, and by joining our Patreon for bonus episodes and video versions and extended shows where we cut out the most fun parts because they're not relevant. But if you want to get crackhead energy and understand our Twitter inside jokes, check out the extended shows. Also in video version, you can see my hats, which is very important. And you can find me personally under Dot Darling on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Patreon, and I'm also speaking at AvalonCon this summer. In-person tickets are sold out, but digital tickets are still available. So if you want to hear me talk, that's also an option.
And I'm Nike, Warrior Witch Nike, pretty much everywhere. Warrior Witch N on Twitter for my very chaotic energy. YouTube, Patreon, Instagram, sometimes TikTok, but rarely. I think Twitter's the most fun, but also you should subscribe to my YouTube channel because I'm very cool.
I am Temperance Alden. You can find me at Wildwoman Witchraft on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube, at Temperance Alden on Twitter. I'm the author of Year of the Witch, where I discuss closed cultures and cultural appropriation among bread recipes and other fun things.
You should buy 13 copies of it or you're not a real witch.
No, you're not a real witch.
I own 2 copies. That's my flex.
Your flex should be that you need to get the next edition because the new edition coming out soon, I had to make some corrections and I did just add thelemic holidays in my appendix.
I'm going to get another copy of it.
See, 13 copies. Every single update, you got to get a new one. So 13 copies or you're not a real witch. That's the summary of the episode.
That's what makes you a real witch or not.
Correct.